Amen. You may be seated. What a privilege it is to be able to sing together and to know the goodness of God and be dominated by that. Today I want us to go to the Word of God and turn to a very, very familiar story and ask a number of questions about our own lives to try to understand what is an R-rated Sunday school story in a way that changes us and adjusts us so that we live life as though God exists. It is my belief that we either believe that God is real and relevant, or that God is irritating and insignificant. And I mean by that those of us who would consider ourselves Christians. I am more and more convinced that there are a number of what I would call, or perhaps more importantly, what the Bible would call, Christian atheists, who say they believe in God, who have in their lives an important part of their lives, religion, but don't actually live in an active way in light of who God is and what God has done, and the fact that God is not only real, but engaged in all of life. So the first question I want us to ask, even before we get into the text, is, are you a Christian atheist? A Christian in name, but then living like the world around you when crisis hits or pleasures are pursued. In the Bible, we are called to be men and women of faith. We're called to walk by faith and not by sight. We're called to live as though we believe with all of our might that the God of the Bible and His revealed word to us is absolutely and totally true. We're to live in light of the reality of God even when everything around us screams that He doesn't exist or He doesn't care. We're to know He's good and all-powerful and engaged in our lives in a way that is for our good and His glory. I suppose what we could really say is, do you actually believe that the God of the Bible exists? It's interesting as we study Old Testament stories, and if you have your Bible with you this morning, and I hope that you do, if you could open them with me to one of the most famous in the entire Bible, if not the most famous, 1 Samuel chapter 17, where we will see the story of really comparisons. In this story, we'll have a comparison between David and Goliath, perhaps the most important comparison to those in our culture. But really, there are two much more significant comparisons going on here. One is between David and Saul, a man who is mighty in the world and a man who is weak before the world. A man rejected by God because of his consistent pattern of disobedience, and a man accepted and used by God because of the choices he makes in everyday life to honor God. There's definitely here in the context a comparison between David and Saul. But I think even more importantly, especially in our story, there's a comparison between the people of Israel, all of the people of Israel, and one insignificant, not even important enough to be a warrior young boy. And really the focus for us should be a fixation with who God is and what God has done, and then to allow that fixation to drive and dominate how we think, how we feel, how we live, how we act, everything about us. We walk by faith and not by sight. So often when you come to a familiar story like this, we want to be like David, and so many of the commentaries and sermons that I listened to said, defeat the giants in your life. Here's how. 6 steps to fighting giants. And I suppose that could be one of the applications of this amazing story, but I think at the very heart of the story is that we would become those who have a heart for God. And actually, I think that the Spirit would like us to see this story not only as real, there's incredible details. It's the longest story given to us about David in the entire Bible, the central figure that points us so clearly to Jesus, that not only would we have this strength to say, I want to walk by faith, but we'd understand even more importantly how to get there, and then we'd see ourselves not as the hero David, but as those battling to get faith like David's. Walking by faith is not easy. Now maybe you're like me and you have some fears in your life. One of my fears is a fear of heights. I try to battle this by going against it. I somehow, and this maybe makes me a little bit sick, so you can evaluate me later if you're a psychologist or psychiatrist, but I like to challenge myself. And so we are on top of the CN Tower, and they have a glass or fiberglass floor, and you can look down on the pavement below, and you're really high. And I stood before it. The person I was with, who I won't mention her by name, but I married her, would not go on to this floor. She does not have a fear of heights, but she's wiser than the person she married, who I won't mention by name. But I was able to step out onto that floor, and then everything in me froze. I looked down, and my knees literally locked in place, and fear overwhelmed me. And I thought, we're going to be at the top of the CN Tower for the rest of our lives. Well, maybe she would have left and gone and got me food or something like that. I don't know. But I would have been stuck there. So I literally grabbed one of my legs and moved it forward. And I was frozen in time, but I managed to conquer my fear and get across the glass floor. We were celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary, and we went to Mexico, and we went on a hike in Mexico, and we're walking up this steep, at least it felt steep for me, hill, and on the way the path narrowed, and in Mexico they aren't as concerned about safety as we are, and on one side of the path is a cliff, and on the other side is just a wall going up, and we're walking along, and I saw it ahead, and I started to envision myself clinging to the wall, and then this problem happened. Even as I moved over to the wall of rock, there was someone coming the other way. And they were taking my side. And so it was one of those times in life where I thought for sure I would die. I thought for sure I couldn't do it. I wondered if it was even possible to get by. And you should, give me a real hand for this. I did it. I made it by them and survived. You should probably be clapping for Lori, who has to live with me, than me. But I think sometimes we hit fears in life, and it's hard to walk by faith. It's hard to know that the floor will hold or that we won't fall off the cliff. It's hard when sometimes there's things that we shouldn't trust, or not sure if we should trust, or in life where we're just a little bit insecure. Here's the wonderful thing about knowing the God of the Bible. Now notice how I say this. Here's the wonderful thing about not being a practical Christian atheist. If you know God is real and God exists and God is with you, if you know that for sure, then regardless of what you're facing, if you're on His side, if you're submissive to Him, if you've chosen to fight in His way for His glory, you are undefeatable. You, in fact, become all-powerful in Him. Now, sadly, that does not mean that you always win in an earthly way. So many go to this passage about David and Goliath and say, see, if you trust in God, you will win. I'm not entirely sure that's true. In fact, I would argue, as you study the Bible, there are many in the Bible, just go to Hebrews 11, who from an earthly perspective lose. Life is filled with pain and persecution and confusion and, yes, even death and destruction for those who love God. But you will always be able to accomplish what He wants in His strength for His glory. What I want us to do is review the story very briefly and then try to look a little bit closer on how we can become those who learn from David, this weak little shepherd boy, not even strong enough to be a warrior, how to walk by faith all of the time, how to live as though God exists and is real, so that we can put to death practical atheism, so that we can fight our own flesh in disbelief when we look around us and wonder where God is and see Him so clearly in His Word, in His promises, in the reality of those things, and live for Him. The context of this story is so important. Saul has just sinned and lost his favor with God. He chose in little things to live as though God didn't exist. David has been anointed by Samuel, really anointed by God. He is the one king that will point us to Jesus. And the reason that God chose him is not from the outside. Oh, Saul, the outside is amazing. He's tall, he's strong, he's a head taller than everyone else. He's good looking, he's rich, he's the right one to choose for a king from a worldly perspective. He's a champion that can fight other champions. David's not even important enough for his own father to choose him to go before Samuel. If he had to choose one person to be out with the sheep, because you know this couldn't be someone God would choose because he's too young, too small, too weak, you fill in the blank. That's David. And yet, when Samuel comes to the end of the children of this promise, the promise that was made, he seeks out David and finds David and then makes this great statement that you will know well. The world looks at the outside, but God looks at the heart. And we find then displayed now what a heart looks like that's devoted to God in comparison, again, back to Saul, in comparison to someone whose heart is devoted to the world. And really what we discover is all of Israel joins Saul. And David becomes unique. And I am praying that we would see in our own lives where we are like Israel, like Saul, perhaps not like Goliath. We're not attacking the church, we're not attacking God, but so often living life in a worldly manner, thinking that the world and how we see it is what is real, and not living by faith in the reality of who God is. Jesus made this a central theme in his life. I'll give you the 4 times where he just says these words, "Oh, you of little faith." In Matthew 6, he's comparing the treasures and reality of God with the treasures and reality of the world. And then he says, listen, God will take care of you even when everything else falls apart. Will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? I think my favorite story in the New Testament is when Jesus is in the boat and he's sleeping and he's with his disciples who, remember, were fishermen, and they're sailing along, and all of a sudden this storm comes up, as it is known to happen on the Sea of Galilee, and it is enormous, and these fishermen know that they are at risk, and there's Jesus sleeping. You shake him awake, and they say, "Oh, Lord, how can you sleep through this? Wake up, wake up. We're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die." And if Jesus was not real or with them, they would have. These not amateur fishermen, these disciples did it for a living. And Jesus wakes up and rebukes the storm. And they respond in fear. Who is this that the winds and the waves obey him? And then Jesus responds to them in this fascinating way. "Why are you so afraid, O you of little faith?" Why are you seeing the storm from a world perspective rather than in the reality of who God is and what God has done? Peter, an amazing man of faith, he gets out of the boat, he sees his Lord, he walks on water. And yet he sees the storm around, his focus, his fixation with Jesus lessens, and he starts to sink, and then he sinks all of the way and reaches out and is saved. And Jesus responds to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, I don't know about you, but I have never walked on water. Oh, I suppose frozen water. If you are from the prairies, you will understand what I mean. But I've never walked on water. I would look at Peter from an earthly perspective and say, wow. And yet, Jesus looked at Peter and said, keep your focus, keep your fixation with me, keep the reality that drives you, me, and not the world. And then when he had fed the 5,000, so many more, I suppose, probably more like 12 to 15,000, and they were wondering where they would be able to feed the next people, he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Oh, you of little faith, don't you understand that when I am with you, there is nothing and no one to fear, no lack that I can't fill, no power that I can't overcome. There is nothing and no one that can stop someone fully devoted to God." Oh, this doesn't mean that you might not die. Favorite quote in our home, Lori had read it, Corrie ten Boom's book, precious book if you want something that's powerful to read on the trust that she had in God and the power of forgiveness. Amazing woman. And she makes this statement, there is no safer place to be than in the will of God. And she includes in that her sister who died at the hands of prison guards. See, when we start to take into account, when we start to, I suppose, as Abraham did, reason that God exists, then everything else changes, and we become those who walk by faith and not by sight. Now, you might be saying, Pastor, you haven't gone into the text yet, and it's the longest text in the Bible about David. Shouldn't we get there? And my answer is yes, but let's get there understanding our goal. It's not just to enjoy an amazing story about a child that defeats a giant. It's about a child who understands the existence and reality of God and lives in light of it in all of life, even when life itself threatens to overwhelm him and everyone else. Let's be challenged not only to enjoy the story, but to live the story in our own lives. Not so that we can be those who defeat our giants, although I long for you to do that, but so that we can be those who walk by faith and not by sight. Okay, we will not take the time to read the entire story. We will just look at the responses and comparisons of those who live from a worldly perspective and the one who lives as though he actually believes that God exists and is real and is there and is relevant. Or, I suppose, as he will repeatedly say in 1 Samuel 17, he believes in the living God. Now again, remember, all of these Israelites would have claimed to be a covenant people. All of them would have said, yes, I believe in God. Yes, I believe that this God exists. But when push came to shove and the sight was overwhelming, they responded in fear. I suppose we could call this a challenge of perspective or a challenge of worldviews. Their fear was overwhelming, and that's the first place I want us to start, and that is just simply fear. There will come times in life, if we're honest, where we have to walk across, well, I suppose for me I didn't have to, but there are times in life where we have to walk across fiberglass floors that are way up in the sky, or we have to get around people on cliffs. There will come times in our life where, from a worldly perspective, the right response is fear. Now here's all of Israel, and they look up and they see a giant. He is 9'9". Lots of debate as to how could someone be this tall. I think, and again, many commentaries play around with this and say the numbers are wrong. I think we just simply trust the Bible. Last time I checked, God was there and is probably right. So this man is massive and he's trained for war. And you imagine now, Saul is very tall. He's a little over 7 feet. He's very tall. Now you think 9'9", 10 foot is a basketball rim. Okay, so if you ever want to just know kind of perspective, that this guy is huge. Trained for war, his armor weighs 125 pounds, his spear 15 pounds. He is ready to kill. He's a champion of champions. He represents the people and he yells out to Israel, listen, you select your champion, represent your king. Now this is very important in the story and I want you to read it later this afternoon. You represent your king. You're the armies of Saul. I represent my armies and I am going to kill you, my gods versus your king. Even that is a mocking, most commentaries point out. And I would agree. David sees these soldiers as soldiers of God's army, not Goliath. Then he's massive and he stands over and he says, I will fight you. And they respond in verse 11 and verse 24, we are afraid and overwhelmed. When Saul and all Israel, they're following their leader, their king, instead of the true king. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Verse 24, if you didn't catch it. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. May I just again reiterate, rightly afraid. If God doesn't exist. I don't know what you're facing right now. I know in my own life we're walking through some valleys that we have never been before. And if God didn't exist, they would be overwhelming. And sometimes they feel like they are. See, when we remove the reality of God from our situation, what happens is we start to think and feel like the world around us. And if you were facing a 9'9" giant trained for war, more powerful than any other human, perhaps on the earth at that time, this man is and was massive, you would be right to be afraid. Fisherman in a storm, you would be right to be afraid. Walking on water, then sinking, you would be right to be afraid. Cancer, governments, COVID, family relationships, confusion, battle with the flesh, the devil, and the world. Trying to live for Jesus in a world that has gone so wrong. If God doesn't exist, you should live in disorientation and fear all of the time. Or perhaps you'll just entertain yourself to death and deny the reality of what's going on in the world. This world is a mess. Amen? This world is scary. This world is going to overwhelm us as Canadian Christians fully devoted to God, unless God exists. All of Israel, disoriented, dismayed, fleeing. Saul leading them. Fear is right if God is not alive. I want us to look secondly at faith. So fear, now faith. David's response to this situation is confusing. And again, a lot is made of the fact that you see details that are bizarre in this story, bizarre even for the Bible. Details of how much food he brings, of how he travels, of what he says, his interaction with his brother and the disdain that his older brother has for him. There's this interaction then with the whole nation of Israel, then with Saul. What is going on here? And I think what's going on here is we're seeing what a heart for God looks like and what a heart for God has to fight against. It's not only Goliath who is making fun of God and the armies of God. It is also those who are supposed to be on his side now making fun of him. And what does this heart look like? I love verse 37. Again, I would strongly recommend you read this entire passage on your own this afternoon. And David said, "The Lord, Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. The Lord is with me. The Lord is alive." The Lord, and if you go through this passage, just kind of say, what is it about God that David believed? His 6 key attributes. I'm going to fly through these because, again, there's so much more in the whole Bible, but I want to fly through these. What does David believe? What's the faith that David has that he sees clearly and then responds to chaos and fearful situations with this confidence? I think the most important thing is he actually believes that God is living. The living God. He repeats this. The living God. God is real. God is alive. God is who he says he is. Then we find David saying that God is almighty. He's all powerful. God is exclusive. I suppose here jealous. Certainly in the context of what has already gone on with the ark in 1 Samuel and the God of the Philistines, Dagon, and falling down before the ark. Amazing story. God is faithful. Faithful in small things, if you want to call a lion and a bear small. God is jealous. God is relevant. How often do we, in the midst of our lives, instead of living in the presence of God, remove him from the situation? How often are we like the Israelites and either ignore what should be causing us fear if God doesn't exist, or experience that fear and respond in anger and hatred or anxiety and division? See, fear disorients and divides. Faith leads to dependence and unity. This is amazing. Here is this little shepherd boy whose heart is so devoted to God that he walks by faith. He knows God's promises. He knows God's power. He experiences God's presence. He's watched God work in his life before. And so in actual fact, the man or woman of faith realizes that to be afraid before someone as small as Goliath is actually stupid. Okay, do you hear this? Because this is so important. If you don't have faith, you have fear. Your eyes are looking at the situation, removing God from it. If you have faith, then God becomes your all-defining reality, and everything else is seen in light of his greatness. And all of a sudden, this giant is a gnat before the living God. See, if the God of the Bible is true and real and right and with you and relevant and all-powerful and all-knowing and all-wise, if he cares about the situation you're in and you see him, then Goliath becomes almost irrelevant. In fact, we're going to see in just a moment, in terms of how David chooses to fight, Goliath really is irrelevant in comparison to God. And by the way, Goliath might be, you look at that and you say, but my situation is worse. Go to Isaiah 40 and just meditate on the greatness of God and the comparatives given. Nations are but like a drop from the bucket. He measures his massiveness, the heavens by the span of his hand. He literally just goes like this, okay, this is how big the heavens are, and then he stops. See, if the God of the Bible is real and you realize this and live in light of it, then everything else becomes a joy and a privilege. And David, if you notice in this, he literally runs to the fight. And that's where we're going. Fear if you remove God or don't believe he's real and relevant. If you don't walk by faith. If you walk by sight and not faith. Faith changes everything. And now the fight. And by the way, as most scholars have pointed out, I think we need to see in this, if we understand Romans 15:4 and 1 Corinthians 10 verse 11, examples for us in our fight almost exclusively. Ephesians 6, 2 Corinthians 5:10, so many other places, is with the demonic realm. But there is a fight that we're called to engage in, a fight for us with our flesh, with the worldly narratives around us, and not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities of the dark world. The fight is described in verses 38 to 50. It's interesting to me that more time is spent on David's faith than on the actual R-rated fight that occurs. He rejects Saul's armor, I think significant, because you have one who is trained and powerful in the ways of the world and one who can't even wear the armor, probably one of the few suits of armor that all of Israel would have owned. In context, we see that much of it had been taken away in their fights with more powerful neighbors. He can't wear that because it just doesn't feel right for him, and he chooses weaponry that really show his dependence on the power and promises of God. He chooses a sling and 5 stones. Why 5? I don't know. But trust me, if you're going to go to battle with a giant that is the best trained in the world at the time, the most powerful in the world at the time, and you're not even worthy of being a warrior in the army, not even the weakest of the warriors, 5 stones is not enough. Not even close. And so Goliath screams out, "What am I, a dog, that you would send this little boy against me?" But David knows better. And David responds. And David runs towards the giant because he is confident in his God. Verse 45, I suppose, is one of those verses that we all should highlight in our lives. You come at me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Notice in this, he's disagreeing with Goliath's analysis, even though perhaps Goliath was more right. The armies of Israel are the armies of God, not Saul. When you come at me with the world's power, I respond with the power of the living God, the Lord, the great I am, the one who has eternally existed, who is over, the Lord of hosts, over all of the armies of heaven. Goliath, you don't stand a chance. You're the one who's in trouble. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I'll give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts. You wonder why we use this story so often with children. The wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Please notice the key focus of the fight. The glory of God. If you read this story and think about yourself and how you're going to fight your battles, your Goliaths, then you have missed the main point of the story. David wants everyone to see that God is alive. David is passionate about the glory of God, and he's willing to take any risk to display God's greatness and power. Saul is all about himself. Saul is fearful of man. David sees God and runs to the battle because he knows the living God is with him. Goliath makes fun of God. Saul ignores God. David embraces the reality in faith and then fights in God's strength. Please hear again. If we minimize this story to God will give you a comfortable life, if you just fight your Goliath in the name of the Lord, you will miss the point of the story. This is not about an easy life for us. This is about us being so engaged with our sight in who God is, that engages our hearts, that our hearts are devoted to Him, that when we see the name of God being defamed, we stand up and take any risk, no matter what the cost, to battle for the glory of God and the good of His name all around us. We have so lost perspective of who God is and what God has done that we now almost live in light of who we are and what we can do, and we miss the fight either by coasting or by creating chaos. Oh, brother, oh, sister. Are you filled with fear or faith? And it will show by your view of God and His glory, and you're running to engage in the battle to defend Him no matter what the cost. So you might say, well, defend Him. Does God really need to be defended? And the answer is not in His intrinsic value, but definitely He has called us to live for His glory in terms of our reflection of that intrinsic value to the world around us. All of Israel, when they were being called out, said nothing. They were disoriented, dismayed, and fearful. David said, my God is alive. My God is all-powerful. My God is everything that I need to do anything I need to show how awesome He is. And then there's this kind of shout out at the end, I will show you today that God has done this. This is a story more about God than it is about David or Goliath or Saul or the Israelites. Perspective matters. And so often we make a big deal about small things because we haven't made a big deal about the biggest person, God. There's a story about a man who went to his doctor and he said, I think I'm going to die. And the doctor responded, well, how do you think you're going to die? And he said, well, Doc, I'm hurting everywhere. Like there's nothing on my entire body that I don't touch and am filled with extreme pain. The doctor said, okay, well, show me. And so the man reached down to his toe and he touched his toe and then he yelped in incredible pain, disorienting pain. He says, Doc, I please don't make me do that again. And the doctor said, well, touch your knee. And so he fearfully touched his knee and then yelped in pain. He said, "Doc, I'm dying. Don't you know I'm dying? This is horrible. Can you figure out what's wrong? I need so much help." And the doctor said, "Well, can you touch your shoulder?" And he touched his shoulder, and he almost passed out because the pain was so intense. And he said, Doc, help me." The doctor said, "Well, touch your head." And he touched his head, and even his head, he said, "Doc, even touching my head, the pain is so extreme. Doc, I'm going to die." And the doc said, "Okay, that's good. We can stop. I'm ready to help you." And the man said, "Oh, thank you. How much time do I got?" And he said, "Sir, your problem is a dislocated finger." I wonder sometimes in our life if we're so filled with pain, and the problem is not what we're perceiving it to be, the Goliath or chaos, but rather our perspective. Or I suppose, as this text would say, our faith. So here's the questions. We've asked them throughout this whole message. Are you a Christian atheist? Sadly, that's the pattern of the people of God in biblical history and the pattern of the Canadian church. Are you following that pattern? The Numbers 13 pattern, when they go into the promised land and they feel like grasshoppers before their eyes, and Joshua and Caleb go, no, God exists. They're the ones who are small. God is big. How well do you know the God of the Bible? Do you know your problems more than you know the person of Jesus? Are you living life in light of the living God who is faithful and delivers and almighty and jealous for his name? Or are you proclaiming him quietly and living like the world? I suppose the real question is this: do you believe? And are you walking in light of that faith more than the worldly narrative around you that's trying to get your attention and focus? When you see Goliath, is he small and insignificant because God is in your view, or is he massive and overwhelming and causes you to literally have to take your legs and move them the next step because you could die at any moment? 1 Corinthians 10:11 tells us that the Old Testament examples are for our instruction. They're examples for us. One scholar says it like this: may God help us to live as if we actually believe that we are the children of God. May we live as though we believe the gospel is real and relevant because it is, and if we don't, we will find the commands of God, especially when they fight the narrative of the world, irritating and God insignificant. Really, the story boils down to one reality for us. Do we believe the reality of the gospel? That God is real, sovereign, jealous, hates sin. That the one David points most clearly to in the entire Bible, Jesus, is alive and real and came and lived a perfect life and then died on the cross, shedding his blood for us that we might be forgiven and set free and live in fellowship with one another and focus on his glory. And that we can respond to him in faith, believing that we are sinners, believing that he is the one who has redeemed us, accepting his payment for us on the cross, and then choosing to live life in light of that no matter what comes at us, because we walk by faith and not by sight. Today we're going to celebrate communion. That's where I want us to conclude. That's the application of the message. Because it's a call for us to have a first love devotion to God. It's a call for us, as we remember that God actually is real and relevant, to, in that memory, align our lives with him. It's a call for us to repent because we've been walking in the flesh and not in the Spirit. And to rejoice that our freedom and forgiveness is from him, and that our lives are for him and the sake of his name, his glory, his value, his power. So I want us to prepare our hearts by not only reflecting on the story of 1 Samuel 17 and David and Goliath and David and Saul and David and the people of Israel, but even more importantly, the Son of David, Jesus. And then by choosing this day whom we will serve, and saying with Joshua, as for me and my house, as for me and those who are listening online, here in the building, and others who will listen later, we will live life as though God exists because He does, as though His Word is true because it is, and as though how we live matters because it does. And we'll do so in joy and unity and freedom in the fellowship of being partners in the gospel because we serve the living God. So would you quietly prepare your hearts? I will close that time in prayer, and then we will partake together in the Lord's Supper as an application of being those who are in relationship with the living God.